What if I told you that the ancestor of Jesus Christ once sold his own brother into slavery for 20 pieces of silver? That this same man's life spiraled into such moral chaos that he unknowingly slept with his own daughter-in-law. And yet, from this broken, flawed human being would come the royal line of King David, and ultimately the Messiah himself. This is the shocking true story of Judah, the fourth son of Jacob, who should have faded into obscurity, but instead became one of the most pivotal figures in biblical history. His journey takes us from the blood-stained coat of his betrayed brother, Joseph, to a roadside encounter that would expose his deepest hypocrisy. We'll witness a transformation so profound that this man who once callously profited from his brother's suffering would later offer to become a slave himself to protect another. Judah's story isn't sanitized or safe. It's raw, uncomfortable, and brutally honest. It reveals how God weaves redemption through our worst failures and darkest moments. The Lion of Judah didn't start as a lion. He started as a coward, a deceiver, and a broken man who had to face the ugliest parts of himself before he could become the father of kings. This is his story. Judah's story begins in a household filled with tension and heartbreak. His mother, Leah, was trapped in a marriage where she desperately wanted her husband's love, but never truly had it. Jacob loved Rachel, Leah's younger sister, and everyone knew it. Leah had already given birth to 3 sons before Judah came along. With each birth, she hoped that finally Jacob would turn his attention to her. Her first son was Reuben, meaning see a son, because the Lord had seen her misery. Her second was Simeon, meaning one who hears because the Lord heard she was unloved. Her third was Levi, meaning attached, hoping her husband would become attached to her. But when Leah became pregnant for the 4th time, something shifted in her heart. She stopped looking to Jacob for validation. The book of Genesis 29:35 tells us exactly what happened. She conceived again, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, "This time I will praise the Lord." So she named him Judah. That name, Judah, meant praise. After 3 sons where Leah kept hoping Jacob would love her, she decided to stop looking to her husband for what only God could give. She chose to praise God regardless of her circumstances. And from that moment of worship, a child was born who would carry a legacy far beyond anything Leah could have imagined. Judah entered the world as the 4th son, not the firstborn who would normally receive the greatest inheritance. He wasn't special in terms of birth order. He was just another son in a growing family, born to a woman who had finally found peace in praising her God. Judah grew up watching his father's heart belong to someone else. Jacob made no secret of his favoritism, and it shaped everything in their household. The family structure was complicated and painful. Jacob had 2 wives who were sisters, Leah and Rachel, plus 2 concubines, Bilhah and Zilpah. All 4 women bore him children, creating a family of 12 sons and at least 1 daughter. As a young boy, Judah witnessed the constant tension between his mother and Rachel. He felt the weight of being born to the wrong woman. In their culture, being the son of the favored wife mattered enormously. It affected your status, your inheritance, your future, and Judah knew was on the wrong side of that equation. The tension got worse when Rachel finally had a son after years of being unable to conceive. Genesis 34 records, "She named him Joseph and said, 'May the Lord add to me another son.'" Joseph became Jacob's favorite from the moment he was born, being the firstborn son of the wife Jacob actually loved Joseph received treatment none of the other brothers ever experienced. As Judah and his brothers grew older, they worked in the fields tending their father's flocks. They did the hard physical labor, while Joseph seemed to get special privileges. The brothers noticed everything. They saw how their father looked at Joseph differently. They heard the warmth in Jacob's voice when he spoke to Rachel's son. They felt the sting of being overlooked day after day, year after year. When Jacob had something important to say, he often said it to Joseph. When there was a special task, it went to Joseph. The other brothers were treated as workers, but Joseph was treated as precious, as beloved, as the son who truly mattered. This wasn't just minor sibling rivalry. This was a wound that festered in the hearts of 11 brothers who knew they would never be enough in their father's eyes. Judah lived with this reality every day of his childhood. He watched his father's face light up when Joseph entered the room. He saw the gifts, the attention, the love that flowed freely to Joseph. The favoritism created jealousy and resentment that grew like poison. The brothers couldn't help but compare themselves to Joseph and find themselves lacking in their father's eyes, and that comparison poisoned their hearts against their younger brother. Everything reached a breaking point when Joseph was 17 years old. Jacob did something that pushed his sons beyond their limit. Genesis 37:3 explains, "Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him." This wasn't just any piece of clothing. It was a richly decorated coat that screamed favoritism, a visible symbol that Joseph was set apart from his brothers. Every time Joseph wore that coat, it announced to everyone that he was special, that he was favored, that he was more important. The coat screamed inequality with every thread. But the coat was just the beginning. Joseph started having dreams, and he made the terrible mistake of sharing them. In Genesis 37:5-7, we read, "Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, 'Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaf of grain out in the field, when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaf gathered around mine and bowed down to it.'" Think about how that sounded to Judah and his brothers. They were already dealing with being second-class sons. They were already watching Joseph get special treatment. And now Joseph was telling them about dreams where they would bow down to him. The brothers' response was immediate. Verse 8 tells us his brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. The word hated appears multiple times. This wasn't mild dislike. This was deep, bitter hatred that had been building for years. Joseph had another dream even more audacious. In verses 9 and 10, "Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. 'Listen,' he said, 'I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me.'" When he told his father, as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" Genesis 37:4 states, "Plainly, when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him." They couldn't even have a normal conversation with Joseph. The family was completely fractured. That break came when Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers. Verses 13 and 14 rec. "Ord, Israel said to Joseph, 'As you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I'm going to send you to them.' 'Very well,' he replied. So he said to him, 'Go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me.' Joseph traveled to find them, eventually tracking them to Dothan. He had no idea he was walking into a trap. Genesis 37:8 captures the danger, but they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. The brothers spotted Joseph coming from far away, probably recognizing that ornate coat, and instead of feeling any brotherly affection, their first impulse was murder. They had time to see him approaching, time to talk, time to plan, and what they planned was to end his life. The brothers' plan was brutal. Genesis 37:19 and 20 record their words. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." There was mockery when they called him that dreamer. But Reuben tried to save Joseph without revealing his true intentions. Verses 21 and 22. When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. "Let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this system here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him." Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. The brothers agreed. When Joseph arrived, they grabbed him. Verse 23:10. Verse 23. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, or they tore that hated coat off his body. Then verse 24, And they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty. There was no water in it. Then something cold-hearted happened. Genesis 37:2. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Israelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Joseph was trapped in a pit probably, crying out, and his brothers sat down to eat, unmoved by his suffering. That's when Judah spoke up. Genesis 37:27. Genesis 37. Record his words. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. Judah wasn't trying to save Joseph out of compassion. Read his reasoning carefully. He asked, "What will we gain?" It was purely financial. Why waste an opportunity to make money? Why be guilty of murder when they could profit from their brother's misery? Judah found a middle ground between Reuben's mercy and the other's violence, but his solution was just as cruel. The transaction happened quickly. Genesis 37:28. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. 20 shekels was the standard price for a young slave. That's what they decided Joseph was worth. Imagine Joseph's terror as he was pulled from the pit. For a moment he might have hoped his brothers had changed their minds, but then he saw money changing hands. He felt chains on his wrists. He understood that his own brothers were selling him like an animal. The Bible doesn't tell us what Joseph said, but years later his brothers would remember. Genesis 42:21 records their memory. They said to one another, "Surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. That's why this distress has come on us." Joseph had begged them. He had added for mercy, and they ignored every word, every tear. Judah watched the caravan disappear toward Egypt, with Joseph in chains. He had his share of silver as his reward. It seemed like a clean solution. No blood on their hands, no body to hide, and Joseph gone forever. But what Judah didn't know was that this moment would haunt him for decades. 1.6. The deception of Jacob. With Joseph gone, the brothers faced a new problem. How would they explain his disappearance? They needed a believable story and physical evidence. Genesis 37:31. Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They took that beautiful coat and turned it into a prop for their deception. They made it look convincing, like it had been through a violent animal attack. Then they brought it to their father. Verse 32, they took the ornate robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe." Notice the careful wording. They didn't directly lie. They presented evidence and let Jacob draw his own conclusion. They called Joseph your son rather than our brother, distancing themselves even in their words. Jacob recognized it immediately. Verse 33. He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Their plan worked perfectly. Jacob believed exactly what they wanted him to believe. The brothers stood there, watching their father's world collapse. They saw his face change. They heard the pain in his voice, and they said nothing to correct his assumption. Judah was part of this deception. He watched his father's heart break and said nothing. Jacob's grief was overwhelming. Genesis chapter 37s, 34 and 35. Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." So his father wept for him. Jacob's grief went beyond normal mourning. He refused all comfort. He declared he would never stop grieving, that he would mourn until he died. This wasn't temporary sadness. This was a wound that would never heal. Think about that scene, the guilty sons approaching their father, offering comfort. Judah and his brothers speaking soothing words about a tragedy they had caused. It was twisted. The deceivers comforting the deceived. Joseph had been more than just a son to Jacob. He was Rachel's firstborn, representing Jacob's connection to his beloved wife who had died. Losing Joseph felt like losing Rachel again. The household became divided by a lie. Judah had to live with his father's grief every single day. He had to watch Jacob's eyes fill with tears at random moments. He had to hear him speak Joseph's name with longing. He had to witness how his father aged rapidly under grief's weight. Years passed, and Jacob's grief never diminished. The text emphasizes Jacob wept for him, suggesting ongoing repeated weeping. This wasn't crying that happened once. This was a father who wept again and again, day after day. The Bible doesn't record Judah's private thoughts, but we understand what he must have carried. He was the one who proposed selling Joseph. The idea had been his. Yes, the others agreed, but Judah had been the architect. Every morning, Judah woke up and faced his father, knowing the truth. Jacob would never know. He had to look into grief-stricken eyes and keep his face neutral, keep the secret locked inside. He had to participate in family meals where Jacob might suddenly start crying. Judah couldn't confess. What would confession accomplish? Joseph was gone, possibly dead. Telling the truth wouldn't bring him back. It would only shatter whatever trust remained in the family. So Judah was trapped. He couldn't undo what had been done. He couldn't confess without making everything worse. He could only carry the burden silently and watch his father suffer because of his choices. The weight of this secret affected everything. It shaped how Judah related to his brothers, all bound together by shared guilt. They couldn't speak freely about that day, even among themselves. When together, the unspoken truth hung in the air. The memory of Joseph's pleading face haunted Judah. He remembered Joseph's voice begging them to reconsider. He remembered the sound of chains, the sight of the caravan growing smaller, the weight of silver coins, blood money from his own brother's suffering. Every time Jacob mentioned Joseph's name, every time tears rolled down his father's cheeks, Judah was reminded of his role in causing that pain. The guilt was enormous, inescapable. Judah had thought selling Joseph would solve their problem. It would remove the favored brother, end the dreams, silence the reminder that they weren't enough, but the solution created a far bigger problem. Their father's heart was shattered beyond repair. This burden would shape Judah's character in the years ahead. He couldn't change the past, couldn't bring Joseph back, couldn't ease his father's pain without destroying what remained. He could only move forward, carrying this knowledge into every decision and every moment of his future. After everything that happened with Joseph, something changed in Judah. He made a decision that would completely alter the direction of his life. Genesis 38:1 tells us what happened. At that time, Judah left his brothers and went down to stay with a man of Adullam named Ha. The phrase "at that time" connects directly to the Korean events we just saw, the selling of Joseph and the deception of Jacob. Right after participating in those terrible acts, Judah physically separated himself from his family. He left his brothers and went down to Adullam, a Canaanite town in the lands west of Hebron. This wasn't a short trip or a business journey. The text says he went down to stay, indicating he was settling there, making it his new home. He was putting distance between himself and his brothers, between himself and his father's ongoing grief, between himself and his father's ongoing grief, between himself and the daily reminder of what they had done. We don't know exactly why Judah left. The Bible doesn't tell us his reasons. Maybe the guilt was too heavy to carry while living among his brothers. Maybe watching his father's unending sorrow became unbearable. Maybe he needed to escape the constant presence of his crime. Or maybe he simply wanted to start fresh, somewhere else to build his own life, separate from the family drama. Whatever his reasons, Judah was leaving behind everything he knew, his father's household, his brothers, his heritage, his people. He was going to live among Canaanites, foreigners who didn't worship his God or follow his family's ways. He was stepping away from his identity as one of Jacob's sons and starting something new. The man he stayed with was named Ha, an Adullam, who would become Judah's friend. This friendship suggests Judah wasn't just passing through. He was integrating into Canaanite society, building relationships, making connections. He was becoming part of their world. Once Judah settled in Adullam, he did something that would have shocked his grandfather Abraham. Genesis 30:82 records. What happened next? There, Judah met the daughter of a Canaanite man named Shua. He married her and made love to her. This was a significant decision, and not in a good way. Judah's great-grandfather Abraham had made his servants swear not to get a wife for his Isaac from the Canaanites. Abraham had said in Genesis 24:3, I want you to swear by T, ye Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not get a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I am living. Abraham wanted his son to marry within their own people, someone who shared their faith and values. Isaac had done the same thing with Jacob, sending him back to their relatives in Mesopotamia to find a wife rather than marrying a Canaanite woman. This had been important to their family, maintaining their distinctiveness, their covenant relationship with God, their separation from the idolatrous practices of Canaan. But Judah ignored all of that. He saw a Canaanite woman, the daughter of a man named Shua, and he married her. The text doesn't even give us her name. She's simply called the daughter of Shua or Bathshua in Hebrew. We don't know if Judah loved her or if this was simply a practical arrangement. We don't know if she worshipped Judah's God or kept her Canaanite beliefs. The text moves quickly past these details. What we do know is that Judah was fully assimilating into Canaanite culture. He wasn't just living among them, he was marrying into their families, becoming one of them. He was drifting further from his father's house and his family's faith with each decision he made. Genesis 38:3 tells us, she became pregnant and gave birth to a son, who was named. Then, verse 4, she conceived again and gave birth to a son, and named him Onan. And verse 5, she gave birth to still another son, and named him Shelah. It was at Kezib that she gave birth to him. 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah. Judah now had his own family, his own household, his own legacy building in Adullam. He was no longer just one of Jacob's 12 sons. He was a father, a husband, establishing his own line, separate from his brothers. But this separation from his heritage and his people would soon lead to consequences that Judah couldn't have predicted. His choice to marry outside his faith and family would set in motion a series of events that would force him to confront who he really was. Years passed and Judah's sons grew up. When his firstborn son reached the age to marriage, Judah arranged a marriage for him. Genesis 38:6 tells us Judah got a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. This is the first time we hear Tamar's name. We don't know much about her background, whether she was a Canaanite, like Judah's wife, or from another group. What we do know is that she married and became part of Judah's household, with all the hopes and expectations that came with being the wife of her firstborn son. But something was terribly wrong with the next verse reveals a shocking truth. Genesis 38:7 states plainly, but Judah's firstborn was wicked in the Lord's sight. So the Lord put him to death. The text doesn't tell us what that was so wicked. It doesn't give us details about his specific sins or actions. What it does tell us is that his wickedness was serious enough that God himself intervened. This wasn't a natural death or an accident. This wasn't a natural death or an accident. The Lord looked at Her's life and actions and decided his wickedness required immediate punishment. Imagine Judah's shock and grief. His firstborn son, the one who would carry his name and inheritance forward, was suddenly dead. The son he had raised, the one he had arranged a marriage for, was gone, and the reason given was that was wicked in God's sight. This left Tamar in a terrible position. She was a widow with no children. In their culture, a woman's security and status came through her husband and sons. Without either, she was vulnerable and had no future. She couldn't inherit her husband's property. She couldn't support herself. She was dependent on her father-in-law's family for survival. But there was a custom that could help her. It was called lay, verit marriage, a practice where, if a man died without children, his brother was supposed to marry the widow and father a child who would be considered the dead brother's heir. This kept the family line going and protected the widow. Judah knew this custom, and he had another son. Following the custom of their people, Judah told his second son, Onan, to fulfill his duty to his dead brother's widow. Genesis 38 records Judah's instruction. Then Judah said to Onan, "Sleep with your brother's wife, and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law, to raise up offspring for your brother." This was Onan's responsibility as the next brother in line. He was supposed to marry Tamar and give her children who would be counted as descendants, ensuring that his name and inheritance wouldn't disappear. It was about family obligation, about protecting the widow, about preserving the dead brother's legacy. Onan agreed to the arrangement. He married Tamar and lived with her as husband and wife. But Genesis 38:9 reveals what Onan did in secret, but Onan knew that the child would not be his. So whenever he slept with his brother's wife, he spilled his semen on the ground to keep from providing offspring for his brother. Think about how calculated and selfish this was. Onan understood the situation perfectly. He knew that any child born to Tamar would be considered heir, not his. That child would receive portion of the inheritance as the firstborn, while Onan would receive less. So Onan came up with a plan. He would go through the motions of fulfilling his duty. He would enjoy the physical benefits of having Tamar as his wife, but he would deliberately prevent her from getting pregnant. Every time they were together, Onan made sure there would be no child. He was using Tamar for his own pleasure, while denying her what she was legally and morally owed. He was pretending to fulfill his obligation while actively sabotaging it. He was lying to everyone, to his father, to Tamar, to his family, while pursuing his own selfish interests. Genesis 38:10 tells us God's response. What he did was wicked in the Lord's sight. So the Lord put him to death. Also God saw through Onan's deception. The Lord recognized the wickedness of using Tamar while denying her justice. Onan's actions weren't just about refusing to father a child. They were about selfishness, greed, and the cruel exploitation of a vulnerable woman. And just like with God's judgment, was swift and final. Now Judah had lost 2 sons. Both had died after being with Tamar. Both deaths were described as divine judgment for wickedness, and Tamar was still a childless widow, still waiting for the justice and security she had been promised. Judah was now in a difficult position. He had 1 son left, Shelah his youngest. According to the custom, Shelah should be the next one to marry Tamar and give her the children she was owed, but Judah was afraid. 2 of his sons had died after marrying this woman. What if Shelah died too? Genesis 38:1 tells us what Judah decided. Judah then said to his daughter-in-law, Tamar, "Live as a widow in your father's house, until my son Shelah grows up," for he thought he may die too, just like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. On the surface, Judah's response seemed reasonable. Shelah was still young, not ready for marriage yet. Judah told Tamar to wait in her father's house until Shelah grew up, and then they would fulfill the obligation. It sounded like a fair request. Just give it some time. But the text reveals Judah's true thoughts, for he thought he may die too, just like his brothers. Judah was afraid that Tamar was somehow cursed or dangerous. He looked at the deaths of Er and Onan and blamed Tamar alleging his son's wickedness. He saw her as the problem, the common factor in both deaths. So Judah made a promise he had no intention of keeping. He told Tamar to wait for Shelah, but in his heart he had already decided that Shelah would never marry her. He was sending her away to protect his last remaining son, regardless of what that meant for Tamar. Tamar obeyed. She went back to her father's house and lived there as a widow, waiting for the day when she would be called back to marry Shelah. She wore widow's clothing as a sign of her status. She remained unmarried, faithful to the promise that had been made to her. She waited, believing that Judah would keep his word. But time passed. Shelah grew from a boy into a man. He reached the age when he should have married Tamar and fulfilled his duty, and Judah did nothing. He made no move to call Tamar back. He made no arrangements for the marriage. He simply let time go by, hoping Tamar would eventually give up or forget. Tamar was trapped. She couldn't marry anyone else because she was technically pledged to Shelah. She couldn't have children or build a future. She couldn't move forward with her life. Judah's broken promise had left her in a permanent state of limbo, not truly a widow free to remarry, but not a wife either. She had no status, no security, no hope, and Judah seemed perfectly content to leave her there. Tamar waited and waited, watching as Shelah grew into full manhood, while Judah made no move to fulfill his obligation. Then something happened that changed the situation. Genesis 38:12 tells us, after a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. When Judah had recovered from his grief, he went up to Timnah to the men who were shearing his sheep, and his friend, Hai the Adullamite, went with him. Judah's wife had died. After his period of mourning ended, he traveled to Timnah for the sheep shearing, which was a festive celebrator. Why time? It was like a harvest festival, a time when people gathered, ate, drank, and celebrated the year's work. Someone told Tamar what was happening. Genesis 38:13 says, "When Tamar was told, 'Your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep,' news traveled and Tamar heard that Judah was leaving his home and heading toward Timnah. This news triggered something in Tamar. She looked at her situation clearly. Shelah was fully grown now, old enough to have been married for years, but Judah had never called her back. He had never fulfilled his promise. She realized with painful clarity that he never would. She had been faithful, patient, and obedient, and it had gotten her nowhere. Tamar had a choice. She could continue waiting forever for a promise that would never be kept, slowly fading into poverty and obscurity as a forgotten widow, or she could take matters into her own hands. She chose action. Genesis 38:14 describes what she did. She took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, and then sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that, though Shelah had now grown up, she had not been given to him as his wife. Tamar's plan was bold and risky. She removed her widow's clothing and covered herself with a veil. She positioned herself at Enaim along the road to Timnah, where Judah would pass. She was disguising herself, making herself look like something she wasn't. In that culture, women who sat veiled by the roadside were often shrine prostitutes, women who practiced cultic prostitution as part of Canaanite religious rituals. Tamar was going to pretend to be one of these women. She was going to use deception to get from Judah himself what he had denied her through his son. It was a desperate plan. If it failed, she could be punished severely. If she was discovered, she could be killed. But Tamar had calculated the risks and decided they were worth it. She had been denied justice through legal means. Judah had broken his promise and left her with no future. So she would use the only power she had left, deception, to claim what was rightfully hers. Judah traveled along the road to Timnah, probably talking with his friend Hiah, enjoying the journey. Then he saw a woman sitting by the roadside, her face covered with a veil. Genesis 38:15 tells us, "When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face." Judah made an assumption based on her appearance and position. He saw a veiled woman by the road and concluded she was selling herself. And instead of passing by, instead of continuing to Timnah, Judah made a decision. Genesis 38:16 describes what happened. Not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, "Come now, let me sleep with you. And what will you give me to sleep with you?" She asked. Judah propositioned her directly. He offered to pay for her services, and Tamar, still disguised, asked the obvious question. What would he pay? She was negotiating, playing the role perfectly, keeping her voice disguised so he wouldn't recognize her. Judah responded in verse 17, "I'll send you a young goat from my flock," he said. "Will you give me something as a pledge until you send it?" she asked. Judah didn't have payment with him, so he promised to send a young goat later. This was a significant payment, showing Judah was willing to pay well for this encounter. But Tamar wasn't satisfied with just a promise. She wanted security, a guarantee that the payment would come. She asked for a pledge, collateral he would leave with her until the goat arrived. Judah asked the natural question in verse 18. He said, "What pledge should I give you? Your seal and its cord, and the staff in your hand." She answered, "Red." So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she became them to her, and she became pregnant by him. Think about what Tamar asked for. She didn't ask for something small or insignificant. She asked for his seal and its cord and his staff. In there, Culture: these items were personal identifiers, like a signature or ID card. The seal was used to mark documents and property as belonging to Judah. It was engraved with his unique mark. The cord held the seal and was worn around the neck. The staff was a walking stick that was often carved or decorated in a distinctive way. These three items together were unmistakably Judah's. Anyone who saw them would know they belonged to him. They were his identity, his signature, his personal mark, and he handed them over to this woman for a promise to send a goat. Judah slept with her. He had no idea he was lying with his own daughter-in-law. He had no idea. This woman was Tamar, the widow he had promised to his son Shelah years ago. He thought he was having a simple transaction with a prostitute by the roadside. Genesis 38:19 tells us what happened next. After she left, she took off her veil and put on her widow's clothes again. Tamar went home, removed her disguise, and returned to her widow's clothing. She carried with her Judah's seal, cord, and staff, and she was pregnant with his child. Her plan had worked. She had obtained from Judah himself what he had denied her through his son. Judah kept his word about sending payment. Genesis 38:20 tells us, "Meanwhile Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adullamite in order to get his pledge back from the woman, but he did not find her. Judah sent Hia back to Enaim with the goat to pay the woman and retrieve his seal, cord, and staff. But when Hia arrived, the woman was gone." Verse 21 continues, "He asked the men who lived there, 'Where is the shrine prostitute who was beside the road at Enaim?' 'There hasn't been any shrine prostitute here,' they said. Hia searched for her, asking around town, but the local men told him there was no shrine prostitute there. They had no idea who he was talking about. Hia returned to Judah empty-handed and reported what he had learned in verse 22. So he went back to Judah and said, 'I didn't find her.' Besides, the men who lived there said, 'There hasn't been any shrine prostitute here.' Judah had a problem. His personal items, his seal, cord, and staff, were out there somewhere, with a woman he couldn't find. But he made a decision in verse 23. Then Judah said, 'Let her keep what she has, or we will become a laughingstock. After all, I did send her this young goat, but you didn't find her this young goat, but you decided to cut his losses.' He didn't want people finding out he had slept with a roadside prostitute, and then couldn't even locate her to get his belongings back. It would be embarrassing, humiliating. Better to just let it go and move on. He had tried to fulfill his obligation by sending the goat. That was enough. So Judah forgot about the incident and went on with his life. He had no idea what was coming. 3 months passed. Then news reached Judah that would turn his world upside down. Genesis 38:4 records the moment. About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar is guilty of prostitution, and as a result, she stops. And as a result, she is now pregnant." Judah said, "Bring her out and have her burned to death." Someone had discovered that Tamar was pregnant. She was still living as a widow in her father's house, still technically pledged to Shelah, and now she was obviously carrying someone's child. In their culture, this was a serious offense. She was betrothed to Shelah, so being pregnant by another man was considered adultery. Judah's response was immediate and harsh. He didn't ask questions, he didn't investigate. He simply pronounced judgment. Bring her out and have her burned to death. This was the penalty for such a serious breach. Judah, who had broken his own promise to Tamar, who had left her trapped in widowhood for years, who had just slept with a woman he thought was a prostitute. This same Judah had no mercy for Tamar. He was ready to execute her for the very type of behavior he had just engaged in himself. The hypocrisy was stunning. Judah could sleep with a prostitute and think nothing of it. But Tamar getting pregnant deserved death. Judah had failed in his obligations to her, but she was the one who should die. But then something happened that changed everything. Genesis 38:2 describes the moment. As she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law. "I am pregnant by the man who owns these," she said. And she added, "See if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are." Tamar was being led out to her execution, but she had planned for this moment. She took Judah's seal, cord, and staff and sent them to him with a message. She didn't publicly shame him. She didn't announce who the father was. She simply presented the evidence and asked him to recognize whose items they were. She was giving Judah a choice. He could stay silent and let her die, protecting his reputation, or he could tell the truth and admit what he had done. The decision was entirely his. Judah looked at those items, his seal, his cord, his staff, his personal identifiers that he had given to a veiled woman by the roadside 3 months ago, and in that moment Judah saw himself clearly. He saw his hypocrisy. He saw his failure. He saw how he had broken his promise to Tamar and left her without options, and how she had taken matters into her own hands. Genesis 38:26 records his response. Judah recognized them and said, "She is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah." And he did not sleep with her again. Judah did something that must have shocked everyone present. He publicly confessed. He admitted that the items were his. He acknowledged that he was the father of Tamar's child. And then he texted something even more shocking. He declared that Tamar was more righteous than he was. Judah took full responsibility. He admitted his failure to give Shelah to Tamar as he had promised. He recognized that Tamar's deception was a direct result of his broken promise and neglect. He saw that she had been fighting for justice, that he had denied her, and instead of making excuses or trying to minimize his guilt, he simply told the truth. This was a turning point for Judah. The man who had helped sell his brother and deceive his father, who had broken his promise to his daughter-in-law and was ready to execute her for getting pregnant, finally confronted his own sin and admitted it publicly. When Judah looked at his seal cord and staff, the items he had given to a veiled woman 3 months earlier, everything became clear. He was holding the proof of his own guilt in his hands. The woman he had ordered to be burned to death. War, pregnant with his child, not someone else's, and she was the same daughter-in-law he had failed and abandoned for years. Judah stood at a crossroads. He could stay silent, let Tamar die and protect his reputation. No one would know the truth if he just kept quiet, or he could do something he had never done before. Tell the complete truth, regardless of the cost to himself. Genesis 38:26 records what Judah chose. Judah recognized them and said, "She is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah," and he did not sleep with her again. These words were revolutionary. Judah didn't make excuses. He didn't try to spin the story in his favor. He didn't blame Tamar for tricking him or defend himself by pointing out her deception. Instead, he made a public declaration that shocked everyone listening. "She is more righteous than I." Daddy, think about what Judah was admitting. He was confessing, in front of his entire community, that he had slept with someone he thought was a prostitute. He was acknowledging that he had broken his promise to give Shelah to Tamar. He was accepting full responsibility for putting Tamar in a position where she felt she had no choice but to deceive him. He was admitting that a woman, someone with no power or status in their society, had acted more justly than he had. This was completely different from the Judah who had proposed selling Joseph. That Judah had asked, "What will we gain?" and thought only of profit and self-interest. That Judah had watched his father grieve over a lie and said nothing. That Judah had broken his promise to Tamar without a second thought. But this Judah was different. He was taking responsibility. He was telling the truth, even when it hurt. He was choosing integrity over self-protection. The confession didn't undo his failures, but it showed that something had changed deep inside him. The text adds, "One more detail, and he did not sleep with her again." Judah recognized that Tamar was his daughter-in-law, and their encounter had been a one-time situation born out of deception and desperation. He didn't try to continue a relationship with her or treat her as a wife. He respected the boundaries of what had happened and took care of her as family, as someone under his protection and responsibility. Judah's public confession saved Tamar's life. His willingness to be honest, to expose his own sin, to admit he was wrong. This was the beginning of his transformation from a man who ran from responsibility to a man who faced it head-on. Tamar's pregnancy continued, and when the time came for her to give birth, something unexpected happened. Genesis 38:27 tells us, "When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb." Twins. Tamar wasn't carrying just one child, but two. This was significant because it meant Judah's line would continue through not one but two sons. The family legacy that had seemed in danger when and Onan died was now secured with two new generations. But the birth itself was unusual. Genesis 38:28 and 29 describe what happened. As she was giving birth, one of them put out his hand. So the midwife took a scarlet thread and tied it on his wrist and said, "This one came out first." But when he drew back his hand, his brother came out, and she said, "So this is how you have broken out." And he was named Perez. The midwife was watching carefully to see which twin would be born first, because the firstborn received special status and inheritance rights. When one baby's hand emerged first, the midwife quickly tied a scarlet thread around his wrist to mark him as the firstborn. Everything seemed settled. But then something strange occurred. The baby pulled his hand back into the womb, and his brother came out first instead. The midwife was shocked by this unexpected turn and exclaimed about how this child had broken out ahead of his brother. Because of this, they named him Perez, which means breaking out or breach, and Genesis 38:30 completes the story. Then his brother, who had the scarlet thread on his wrist, came out, and he was named Zer. The second twin, the one who had put his hand out first, was finally born, and named Zer, which means scarlet, or brightness, likely referring to the scarlet thread tied on his wrist. This birth story carried meaning beyond just the unusual circumstances. Perez, the one who broke through and came out first, despite his brother's hand appearing first, became the ancestor through whom Judah's most important descendants would come. The line of King David would come through Perez, and ultimately Jesus Christ himself would be descended from Perez. Tamar, the Canaanite woman, who had been wronged and abandoned, who had to use deception to claim her rights, became one of only a few women mentioned by name in the genealogy of Jesus. Her twins secured Judah's legacy and became part of the story of redemption that would unfold over the coming centuries. Years passed after Tamar's twins were born. Judah continued living his life, raising his sons, managing his household. Meanwhile, back in his father Jacob's camp, the family dynamics were shifting. The 12 brothers were aging, and it was becoming clear that leadership among them needed to be established. By birth order, Reuben should have been the natural leader. He was the firstborn, the one who should have received the double portion and the authority that came with it. But Reuben had disqualified himself through his own actions. Genesis 35:22 records that Reuben had slept with Bilhah, his father's concubine, a serious offense that cost him his position. The next in line was Simeon and Levi, but they had also proven themselves unfit for rise leadership. Back in Genesis 34, they had deceived and massacred all the men of Shechet and revenge for their sister Dinah being violated. Their violence and deception had endangered the whole family and showed they were driven by rage rather than wisdom. This meant that Judah, the fourth son, was next in line, and unlike his older brothers, Judah had shown growth and change. His public confession about Tamar had demonstrated a capacity for honesty and taking responsibility. His willingness to admit when he was wrong set him apart from brothers who either acted rashly or failed in their duties. The Bible doesn't give us a specific moment when Judah officially became the leader among his brothers. Instead, we see it emerging naturally through the events that would unfold. Judah's brothers began looking to him for decisions. When difficult situations arose, they turned to Judah. His voice carried weight that the older brothers' voices had lost. Judah was developing that into someone his brothers could trust. The man who had once been driven by self-interest and profit was becoming someone who thought about family, about duty, about doing what was right, even when it was hard. His transformation wasn't instant or dramatic. It was gradual, built through choices made over years, through lessons learned the hard way. This leadership would be tested in the most severe way possible when famine struck their land and forced them into a situation none of them could have predicted. A severe famine spread across the entire region. Crops failed. Animals died. Food became scarce. Jacob's family, like everyone else, faced the real possibility of starvation. Genesis 42:1 captures Jacob's urgency. When Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you just keep looking at each other? Jacob had heard news that Egypt had grain available for purchase. Somehow, Egypt had prepared for the famine and had food stored up. Jacob couldn't understand why his sons were just sitting around when they could go get food to save their family. Verse 2 continues. He continued, "I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us, so that we may live and not die." This wasn't optional. This was the survival. The family needed food, and Egypt was their only option. So, 10 of Joseph's brothers prepared to make the journey. Genesis 42:3 tells us, "Then 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt." Notice it says 10 brothers, not all 12. Verse 4 explains why. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with the others because he was afraid that harm might come to him. Benjamin was Joseph's full brother, both sons of Rachel. After losing Joseph, Jacob was terrified of losing Benjamin too. He kept his youngest son at home where he could protect him. The 10 brothers traveled to Egypt and eventually stood before the man in charge of selling grain. They had no idea they were standing before Joseph, their own brother, whom they had sold into slavery more than 20 years earlier. Joseph recognized them immediately, but they didn't recognize him. Joseph decided to test his brothers to see if they had changed. He accused them of being spies. He put them in prison for 3 days. Then he told them that to prove their story, they needed to bring their youngest brother Benjamin to Egypt. Genesis 42:119 records. Joseph's demand, "If you are honest men, let one of your brothers stay here in prison while the rest of you go and take grain back for your starving households." Verse 20 continues, "But you must bring your youngest brother to me, so that your words may be verified, and that you may not die." Joseph kept Simeon as a hostage, and sent the other brothers home with grain and instructions to return with Benjamin. The brothers were terrified. They remembered what they had done to Joseph, and Genesis 42:21 reveals their guilt. They said to one another, "Surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. That's why this distress has come on us." And after more than 20 years, they still remembered Joseph's cries. They still carried the guilt, and now they believed they were being punished for what they had done. The brothers returned home to Canaan with grain, but also with impossible news. They had to take Benjamin to Egypt or Simeon would die, and they couldn't buy more grain. Jacob's response in verse 36 was absolute refusal. Their father Jacob said to them, "You have deprived me of my children. Joseph is no more and Simeon is no more, and now you want to take Benjamin. Everything is dazed me." Jacob refused to send Benjamin. Reuben tried to convince him by offering his own 2 sons as collateral in verse 37, but Jacob wouldn't budge. The grain they had brought would eventually run out, and then they would face an impossible choice: starve or send Benjamin to Egypt. Time passed, and the grain the brothers had brought from Egypt began running low. The family faced starvation again. They had no choice. They needed to return to Egypt for more food, but they couldn't go without Benjamin, and Jacob still refused to send him. Genesis 43:1 and 2 set the scene. Now the famine was still severe in the land. So when they had eaten all the grain they had brought back from Egypt, their father said to them, "Go back and buy us a little more food." But Judah reminded his father of the Egyptian ruler's strict command. Verse 3, "But Judah said to him, 'The man warned us solemnly, you will not see my face again unless your brother is with you.'" There was no way around it. No Benjamin meant no grain, which meant death for the entire family. Jacob resisted. He couldn't understand why they had even mentioned Benjamin to the Egyptian official, but the brothers explained they had no choice. The man had questioned them directly about their family. Everything had seemed innocent at the time. Then Judah did something that showed how much he had changed. He stepped forward with a proposal that was completely different from anything Reuben had offered. Genesis 43:8 and 9 record Judah's words. "Then Judah said to Israel, his father, 'Send the boy along with me, and we will go at once, so that we and you and our children may live and not die. I myself will guarantee his safety. You can hold me personally responsible for him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him here before you, I will bear the blame before you all my life." Look carefully at what Judah was offering. Reuben had offered his 2 sons as collateral. He was willing to let his children pay for his failure. But Judah offered himself. He said, I myself will guarantee his safety. He said, you can hold me personally responsible. He promised that if Benjamin didn't return, Judah would bear the blame before his father for the rest of his life. This wasn't just a promise. This was Judah putting his entire relationship with his father on the line. He was saying that if Benjamin didn't come back, Judah would accept complete and permanent disgrace. He would lose his father's respect, his standing in the family, his honor. Everything would be forfeit. Judah added in verse 10, As it is, if we had not delayed, we could have gone and returned twice. He was being practical and urgent. Every day they waited was a day closer to starvation. They needed to act now. Jacob finally agreed to Judah's proposal. The guarantee Judah offered his personal responsibility, his willingness to bear the consequences, himself was enough to convince Jacob to let Benjamin go. Genesis 4:3, 1:4 describe Jacob's instructions. He told them to take gifts, to take double the silver. And then he added in verse 14, And may God Almighty grant you mercy before the man, so that he will let your other brother and Benjamin come back with you. As for me, if I am bereaved, I am bereaved, I am bereaved. Music Jacob was entrusting Benjamin to Judah's care. He was placing his most precious remaining son into the hands of the brother who had once proposed selling Joseph. But Judah was no longer that man. The guarantee he offered showed he had learned what real responsibility meant. The brothers returned to Egypt with Benjamin, and Joseph received them in his house. He saw Benjamin and was so overcome with emotion that he had to leave the room to weep. After composing himself, Joseph had a meal prepared for them. Everything seemed to be going well. They ate together, though the Egyptians ate separately. Joseph even gave Benjamin 5 times as much food as the others. But Joseph had one final test planned for his brothers. Genesis 44. 1 and 2 describe what he ordered his steward to do. Now Joseph gave these instructions to the steward of his house. Fill the men's sacks with as much food as they can carry, and put each man's silver in the mouth of his sack. Then put my cup, the silver one, in the mouth of the youngest one's sack, along with the silver for his grain. Joseph's silver cup was planted in Benjamin's sack. The brothers left Egypt. Early the next morning, happy and relieved, they had Benjamin with them. They had gotten grain, and they were heading home. But they hadn't gone far when Joseph's steward caught up with them. The steward accused them of stealing Joseph's silver cup. The brothers were shocked and protested their innocence. They were so confident that they made a rash promise in verse 9. If any of your servants is found, to have it, he will die, and the rest of us will become my lord's slaves. But the deferent terms in verse 10. Very well then, let it be as you say. Whoever is found to have it will become my slave. The rest of you will be free from blame. Each brother quickly lowered his sack, and the stewards searched them one by one, starting with the oldest and ending with the youngest. Genesis 44. 12 describes the terrible moment. Then the steward proceeded to search, beginning with the oldest and ending with the youngest, and the cup was found in Benjamin's sack. The brothers were devastated. Verse 13 tells us, at this they tore their clothes. Then they all loaded their donkeys and returned to the city. They could have left Benjamin behind and saved themselves. The steward had said only the one with the cup would be enslaved, but they all went back. None of them was willing to abandon Benjamin. When they reached Joseph's house, they threw themselves on the ground before him. Joseph spoke to them in verse 15. What is this you have done? Don't you know that a man like me can find things out by divination? He was maintaining his disguise as an Egyptian official who had mystical powers of knowledge. Judah answered for all of them in verse 16, What can we say to my lord? What can we say? How can we prove our innocence? God has uncovered your servant's guilt. We are now my lord's slaves, we ourselves and the one who was found to have the cup. But Joseph had the same response as his steward. Verse 17, But Joseph said, Far be it from me to do such a thing. Only the man who was found to have the cup will become my slave. The rest of you go back to your father in peace. This was the moment of truth. Joseph was giving the brothers an easy way out. They could go home, tell their father that Benjamin had stolen something, and was being kept as a slave, and move on with their lives. It was almost exactly like the situation with Joseph years before. They could abandon a brother and protect themselves. But Judah couldn't do it. He couldn't abandon Benjamin. He couldn't break his promise to his father. He couldn't return home without Rachel's son. Everything in him rebelled against the idea. So Judah stepped forward. What happened next was one of the most powerful speeches in all of Scripture. Judah approached Joseph and asked permission to speak. Genesis 44:18 begins. Then Judah went up to him and said, "Pardon your servant, my lord. Let me speak a word to my lord. Let me speak a word to my lord. Do not be angry with your servant, though you are equal to Pharaoh himself." Judah was about to pour out his heart to this Egyptian ruler, not knowing he was actually speaking to Joseph. He recounted the entire story, reminding Joseph of how he had asked about their family. Verses 19-23 recount the dialogue. "My lord asked his servants, 'Do you have a father or a brother?' And we answered, 'We have an aged father, and there is a young son born to him in his old age. His brother is dead, and he is the only one of his mother's sons left, and his father loves him. Then you said to your servants, Bring him down to me so I can see him for myself. And we said to my lord, The boy cannot leave his father. If he leaves him, his father will die. But you told your servants, Unless your youngest brother comes down with you, you will not see my face again." Judah continued explaining what happened when they returned home in verses 24-29. "When we went back to your servant, my father, we told him what my lord had said. Then our father said, 'Go back and buy a little more food.' But we said, 'We cannot go down. Only if our youngest brother is with us will we go. We cannot see the man's face unless our youngest brother is with us. Your servant, my father, said to us, You know that my wife Bo bore me 2 sons. One of them went away from me, and I said, He has surely been torn to pieces, and I have not seen him since. If you take this one from me too, and harm comes to him, you will bring my gray head down to the grave in misery." Then Judah described his father's current situation in verses 30 and 31. "So now if the boy is not with us, when I go back to your servant, my father, and if my father, whose life is closely bound up with the boy's life, sees that the boy isn't there, he will die. Your servants will bring the gray head of our father down to the grave in sorrow." He was making Joseph understand exactly what losing Benjamin would mean to Jacob. He was explaining that Jacob had already lost one son of Rachel, that Benjamin was all Jacob had left, that Jacob's very life was tied to Benjamin's safety. Judah was helping Joseph see their father's heart, his pain, his desperate love for this youngest son. Then Judah came to the point that changed everything. Genesis 44:3-2. 3:4-3-2, 3:4 contain his final plea. "Your servant guaranteed the boy's safety to my father. I said, If I do not bring him back to you, I will bear the blame before you, my father, all my life. Now then, please let your servant remain here as my lord's slave in place of the boy, and let the boy return with his brothers. How can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? No, do not let me see the misery that would come on my father." Judah was offering to take Benjamin's place as a slave. He was volunteering to give up his freedom, his family, his future, everything, so that Benjamin could go home to their father. He would rather spend the rest of his life in slavery in Egypt than see his father's heart break again. This was the complete opposite of who Judah had been. The old Judah had sold Joseph to avoid responsibility and make a profit. He had his "what will we gain?" and thought only of himself. But this Judah was willing to lose everything to protect his brother and spare his father pain. He was offering himself as a substitute, taking the punishment that Benjamin was facing, sacrificing his own life for someone else. Judah's plea revealed that he understood his father's grief in a way he never had before. He knew what it had done to Jacob to lose Joseph. He had lived with that grief for over 20 years. He had watched it destroy his father. And he was saying he wouldn't let it happen again. He would do anything, pay any price to prevent his father from experiencing that pain once more. Judah's speech broke Joseph. He couldn't maintain his disguise any longer. He sent all the Egyptians out of the room and revealed his identity to his brothers. The reunion was emotional and overwhelming. Joseph forgave his brothers and explained how God had used even their evil actions for good to save many lives through the famine. The family was eventually reunited. Jacob came to Egypt with all his household and was reunited with Joseph, the son he thought was dead. They settled in Egypt, in the region of Goshen, where they prospered and grew. Years passed and Jacob grew old. He knew his death was approaching, so he called his sons to him to bless them and tell them what would happen to their descendants. This wasn't just a father's goodbye. This was prophecy, speaking under God's inspiration about the future of each tribe. When Jacob came to Judah, he spoke words that would echo through all of history. Genesis 49:8, 1-2 contained Jacob's blessing. Judah, your brothers will praise you. Your hand will be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's butt sons will bow down to you. You are a lion's cub, Judah. You return from the prey, my son. Like a lion he crouches, and lies down like a lioness who dares to rouse him. His scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he to whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nations shall be his. He will tether his donkey to a vine, his colt to a choicest branch. He will wash his garments in wine, his robes in the blood of grapes. His eyes will be darker than wine, his teeth whiter than milk. Look at what Jacob prophesied. He said, Judah's brothers would praise him, the very meaning of Judah's name. He said, Judah would be like a lion, powerful and respected. But most importantly, he said, the scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet. A scepter was the symbol of kingship. Jacob was prophesying that kings would come from Judah's line. The leadership that Judah had grown into among his brothers would become permanent and royal in his descendants. The tribe of Judah would produce the rulers of Israel. This prophecy was fulfilled generations later, when David from the tribe of Judah became king of Israel. 2 Samuel chapter 7 records God's promise to David that his throne would be established forever, that his descendants would rule perpetually, every king of Judah after David came from this line. But Jacob's prophecy went even further. He said the scepter would remain with Judah until he to whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nations shall be his D. This was pointing to a future ruler who would not just reign over Israel, but would have the obedience of all nations. This was a messianic prophecy pointing forward to Jesus Christ. Matthew chapter 1 begins with these words in verse 1. This is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. The genealogy that follows traces Jesus' line back through David, through the kings of Judah, through Perez, Judah's son, through Tamar, all the way to Judah himself. Revelation 5:5 calls Jesus the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David. The image of Judah as a lion that Jacob spoke in his blessing became one of the titles of the Messiah. Jesus is called the Lion of Judah, the ultimate fulfillment of everything Jacob prophesied about his son. Think about the journey Judah took. He started as a man who sold his brother for profit and lived with the guilt of breaking his father's heart. He made mistakes with Tamar, breaking promises and acting unjustly. But through his failures, through Tamar's courage in confronting him, through the years of carrying his guilt, Judah changed. He learned to take responsibility. He learned to tell the truth, even when it cost him. He learned to put others before himself. He learned what real love and sacrifice meant. And when the moment came to prove whether he had truly changed, Judah offered himself as a slave to save his brother and protect his father from grief. From this broken, flawed man came the royal line of Israel. From his union with Tamar, which began in deception but ended in justice, came Perez, through whom King David would descend, and ultimately from this messy, complicated family story came Jesus Christ, the Savior of the world. Judah's story shows us that God doesn't just use perfect people. He uses people who fail, who make terrible choices, who carry deep guilt, but who learn, grow, and change. He takes our worst moments and weaves them into his plan of redemption. The Lion of Judah didn't start as a lion. He started as a coward and a failure, but through God's grace and his own willingness to change, he became the father of kings and the ancestor of the King of Kings. If this story impacted you today, I'd love for you to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more biblical stories like this one. These ancient accounts aren't just history. They're filled with lessons for our lives today. And if you know someone who needs to hear that God can redeem even our biggest failures, share this video with them. Let's spread these powerful truths together. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video, where we'll dive into another fascinating character from Scripture. God bless you.